Okay, maybe we should get started. Everybody, we're going to begin.
What a nice showing. So first, let me thank you for coming out today. I think, I guess it's fair to say that we're living in very interesting times. First, let me give President Fry was pretty much emphatic with our having these types of forums. So he's unable to be here today, but he asked me to send his very best regards for this symposium and convening. Let me thank our panelists who are going to speak on these topics, and thank Julie Mostov for her leadership and actually helping to convene this group. I'd say over the last month or so, there's been a lot of changes, and I think our faculty and our panelists are going to speak a lot about how that affects our international students. I think as Provost, I've experienced a lot of anxiety from students and from faculty alike over the last couple of weeks, and we felt like this type of gathering would give us the opportunity to have a conversation and to share, our insights about, the situations that are going on right now. One thing that I thought has been really interesting, and this is and one thing that gives me a real sense of pride for Drexel, is that throughout all the anxiety that our international students are having in our faculty, I think the thing that I remember the most is that our students and our faculty just really have come together. So everyone has wanted to show overwhelming support for our international students and our international body of professionals. So I think, I hope you'll get a chance to kind of voice your opinions through today and get a chance to kind of get some education on what we learned about the executive orders, what we learned about our government, and kind of how, as a university, we move forward as we consider, the changes that we're seeing in our government and our politics and things like that. So with that, I'm not going to stay up here too long. I'm going to say thank you for coming again. I'm going to look forward to hearing some great insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. We are so fortunate to be in a university which is a community of scholars, students, practitioners, professionals who are all committed to the exchange of ideas and openness, inclusivity, equality, and a spirit of exchange, which is really critical to our times. And so what we decided to do today was really to talk about some of the issues that are surround this travel ban and the responses to it, and really the implications, both the impact on individuals and families, but the broader implications, social, economic, political, and certainly broader internationally. And so who better to do that than our own faculty? We have experts across the university, and it's not hard to draw upon them. In fact, it was hard to limit the space at the table. And so I know that we're going to have many more of these kinds of panels where we draw upon the expertise. Because I think one of the telling moments is, telling things about these moments is the fact that people are confused and there's a lot of misinformation. And a university is a place in which we stand for really sharing of ideas, but also rigorous, critical thinking and exploration of truth that is based upon evidence. And that's really something that we celebrate at the university. Of course, we also celebrate diversity, difference, and the enormous benefits that we have gotten over the years of the university from people from all over the world coming together. And so that's something that we're going to talk about more. So I'm just going to begin with our first faculty member, who is Professor Anil Kalam, who is Associate Professor of Law and an expert on immigration law, criminal law, U.S. and comparative constitutional law, and international human rights. And so Anil is at Berkeley right now as a visiting scholar. So he's joining us electronically. And we're really eager to hear from him. He's quite an expert. He's been speaking on on public radio and some other venues. And can you tell us, what are some of the issues? Why is this travel ban causing such an enormous response from universities and from citizens, states, various different voices across the nation? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So thank you so much for holding this forum and having me be part of it. And I also want to just thank the university administration for their leadership in response to this set of developments. I'm sure that many of you saw President Fry's statement. If you have not, I commend it to you. It's a very strong and important statement, and it speaks to what Julie, you're saying. So it's been a chaotic few weeks. The travel ban or Muslim ban executive order really capped off a week. I want to put it in context. There were several executive orders related to immigration, which I think add up to a very clear of resurgent restrictionism. So let me just quickly say, just to put it in context, that there was an order that seeks to defund so-called sanctuary cities and expands dramatically the priorities of people within the United States who might be immigration enforcement priorities. There was an executive order purporting to commence the building of the famous wall that the incoming Republican administration had promised, along with an expansion of streamlined procedures for removal. And then finally, this order, which has two sets of provisions that have attracted a lot of attention. One restricts entry of all individuals who are on immigrant or non-immigrant statuses from the 7 countries that are listed: Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen. I'm forgetting one. Sudan. Thank you. Effectively, those are all majority Muslim countries. And then the second provision shuts down the refugee resettlement program for a period of 90 days, indefinitely for Syrian refugees, and then purports to, when reopening it, create exceptions for people from minority religious backgrounds from those countries. Meaning Christian refugee. And outside of the context of the executive order, there's of course been a lot of other statements by administration officials, both on the campaign trail and even after coming to office, making clear that while this is not a ban on all Muslims, it is targeted towards Muslims. And so that sets the stage for the litigation which has taken place over the last couple of weeks. In the immediate aftermath of the executive order being issued on January 27th, the immigrants' rights and refugee rights legal community had already been ready and mobilizing to ensure that people who might be arriving and then subject to the executive order would then have legal representation. So many of you saw people coming to the airports, meeting lawyers and coordinating litigation and representation for people who were in transit. So very quickly after that, a number of federal courts heard complaints, and in that first weekend, stays were issued of removal in at least 5 courts. The first one being in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn. Part of the challenge there was a procedural one of due process, and ensuring that people's status and their visas are not in fact taken away without a meaningful opportunity to be heard and a right to a hearing. That doesn't affect the entire executive order, though. That only affected people who were in transit. And of course, I'm sure all of you saw news reports of how mixed the implementation and compliance with the orders were, and a lot of confusion about would this executive order apply to legal permanent residents with green cards or not, and that was something that really, in the rush to get this executive order out, the Republican administration did not, in fact, actually clarify that, and there was a lot of confusion about who, in fact, is subject to this order. Now, subsequent to that, there have been legal challenges that go beyond the due process questions to raise more fundamental questions about the constitutionality of the order, whether it amounts to an establishment of religion in violation of the First Amendment, whether it violates the Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against Muslims or on the basis of national origin, whether it exceeds the statutory authority granted to the president. The president has authority to impose some restrictions on immigration under the statute from the 1950s, from really the Red Scare period in the early 1950s, but how far does that authority reach is a question that has not really ever been tested in court. So all of those questions are presented in the lawsuits that have come up since that initial weekend. The case that has been proceeding most quickly is the one in Seattle, and I'm sure many of you saw in the past several days, Judge Robart in Seattle issued a nationwide temporary restraining order, which the Republican administration has now appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The argument was held yesterday. So that's sort of where we are. Those are the issues that are at stake. I think I'll stop there and sort of follow this.
Great. Thanks. So let's take a little step backwards and ask Aaron Graham, who is Assistant Professor of Politics at Drexel, who is an expert in international relations, international organizations, U.S. foreign policy, and focuses on human security, broadly defined, issues around accountability and legitimacy. Aaron, what is an executive order? And maybe you can speak to that. And then, because this executive order is meant to create a safer environment in the United States, I'll ask you that question: are we safer as a result of it?
Okay, thanks, Julie. Can everybody hear me? Are the microphones good?
Louder.
So what do I need to do?
Maybe closer to the mic.
Is that somewhat better? Okay. All right, so the question of what is an executive order is particularly useful today because there's been a little bit of contestation over what can happen when executive orders are given. So the best I can do it is to say that these are essentially official statements or directives given by a president to the executive agencies, that is federal agencies like Homeland Security, the State Department, Justice Department, and others, about how to implement and enforce the law. Many executive orders are meant to interpret and give advice to bureaucracies about how to implement the law, and this can be when, for example, Congress passes legislation where there's some ambiguity around those issues. But a little bit more controversially, some executive orders, and we see this both in the George W. Bush administration and in the Obama administration, are used because they have the force of law, they're used in times when they may not agree with congressional legislation. Okay? Now, like legislative statutes passed by Congress that carry the force of law, executive orders are subject to checks from other branches of government. Now, this is implicit in Neil's comments, of course, as we watch this make its way through the federal appeals court. But at the same time, there has been some misinformation around that today, so I wanted to make that clear. Now, technically, Congress could also choose to pass a law to nullify this. But that would be subject to a presidential veto, and so because the threshold there is quite high, 2/3 vote in the Senate, that's unlikely, and so often we see executive orders contested through the courts on their constitutionality. Okay? Now to Julie's second question that she posed about whether or not this executive order would make us safer, I want to make 4 quick points on this. Okay? The first is to put terrorist attacks by jihadist groups in context and compare them to other threats we might face in the United States. Now, my comments here are going to be based on data collection from the International Security Program at the New America Foundation, which is a prominent independent DC think tank. So in the 15 years since September 11th, jihadist terrorism has killed 94 people in the United States. That works out to about an average of about 7 people per year. Okay? So to put that in context, that's 7 people per year on average in context. About 46 people die each year from lightning strikes in the United States. Car accidents involving a deer kill about 150 people per year. And about 300 people a year die from drowning in bathtubs. Okay? Around 11,000 people per year are killed by gun homicide deaths in the United States. So while certainly every death is tragic, it's really important to keep this in mind as we think about the nature of the threat. Second, I want to zero in on those 94 terrorist deaths by jihadists that were committed in the U.S. Were they committed by terrorists that are from these banned countries that Anil already listed? And the answer is no. None of them has been committed by anyone that came from these countries directly or from families that came from these countries. None of the lethal terrorist attacks in the United States. So at least based on the data, there really isn't justification for calling out these particular countries. The third point is that the additional justification for this that we heard throughout the presidential campaign this year is that refugees coming into the United States are not subject to vetting, that this is a free-for-all and it presents a danger to national security. As I'm sure many of you have read, this isn't the case at all. Refugees are subject to a vetting process by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Only the most vulnerable typically are selected. It's less than 1% of refugees are referred for settlement in a state. Some of those are referred to the United States. Often that process itself takes a number of years while people live in refugee camps. At that time, refugees begin a very rigorous process of background checks with Homeland Security, with the FBI, with the Defense Department in some cases. Syrian refugees and refugees from a couple of other places are subject to more checks. There are interviews with immigration and with the Department of Homeland Security. And so I would invite you all to look up this process. The New York Times has posted it a number of times this year to show that this simply isn't the case, and it's unclear what other measures would be necessary. Now, the 3 points that I raised suggest that the ban, the executive order, is unnecessary. But I would be remiss if I didn't add that, in fact, there's a strong argument that this executive order makes us less safe, and that's because it can certainly lead to increased anti-American sentiment and could be sort of a boon to terrorist organizations and their recruitment efforts. This argument has been made by not just Democrats, but a lot of former Defense Department and military officials. And I'll just end by quoting John McCain and Lindsey Graham, 2 Republican senators, that said, "Ultimately, we fear this executive order will become a self-inflicted wound in the fight against terrorism. Our most important allies in the fight against ISIL are the vast majority of Muslims who reject its apocalyptic ideology of hatred. This executive order sends a signal, intended or not, that America does not want Muslims coming into our country, and that is why we fear this executive order may do more to help terrorist recruitment than improve our security." So I will end there for now.
Thank you very much. Richard Frankel is a professor associate professor, also in the Thomas R. Klein School of Law, and he's the director of the Appellate Litigation Clinic at Drexel, and as I understand, right now they are working in immigration court. So Richard, I wonder if you could say a few words about how this is affecting practitioners and how some of this confusion and then it is really hitting people in the court system and on the ground.
Sure. And I just want to echo Renil's comments commending President Fry for his strong statement against the executive order in support of the community here at Drexel, and to thank Julie for putting this together so quickly. We say in immigration law, Nil is pretty much larger than life, and now he actually looks on the screen. But in terms of how this is affecting the practitioner community, I mean, the words that sort of introduced this program, we heard anxiety, we heard confusion, we heard misinformation, and that's, I feel like, exactly what I'm seeing sort of talking to practitioners, being on listservs, going in court, and while some of that may be resulting from the suggestion that maybe the order was rushed or put out a little bit quickly, the other explanation that's been proffered is that perhaps it was deliberately put out in this way to maximize disruption, to maximize confusion and anxiety among people who would be affected, to sort of demonstrate the reach of executive power. And it certainly, I think, has had that effect in the practitioner community. And so I mean, things are starting to settle out a little bit, but there was certainly a lot of confusion at the beginning about who exactly was affected by the order. Did it apply only to people outside the United States? Did it apply to people inside the United States? Did it apply to people who had a green card or lawful permanent resident status? The government initially said yes, or actually different parts of the government were saying different things initially. Then the executive branch took a strong statement and said yes. Then they later backpedaled and said no, green card holders are safe. And then in addition to the executive order, the State Department, I think, either the day the order was issued or the Monday after the order was issued, it was issued on a Friday, then took the step of revoking visas from all non-immigrant visas from people who were in the United States from the 7 affected countries. And my understanding is that that even was never even made public, but only was revealed in the context of litigation when they had to disclose that information to a court. And then there was a great amount of uncertainty about what that even meant, because in theory that meant that the government, if it wanted to, could immediately put all of those individuals in removal proceedings in immigration court to have them be deported if the government chose to make that priority. There were other stories about even when people were being told they were allowed to come in, that Border Patrol officers would ask them to sign a form. It's called an I-407 without necessarily explaining what it was. And what the form is it's a form that you voluntarily relinquish your lawful permanent resident status. So if the government's position was people with green cards are allowed to come into the country, but we're asking you to sign this form that then would take away your green card status, which would then subject you to possible future removal or deportation. And that wasn't always being clearly explained to people who were being allowed in the country. So there's a lot of that kind of sort of uncertainty. There were lots of stories about what was the next order that was going to be issued. People were hearing stories that more countries were going to be added to the list. There were stories about what other restrictions were going to be placed on refugees who were already in the country. And while some of those turned out to be false, I think the nature in which this order was rolled out and the assertiveness with which the executive branch pushed it out was that there was no way to really, there was no way to have a sense of whether it was real or fake, and every sort of report had to be taken seriously because you didn't know what the administration was going to do next in such an atmosphere of uncertainty and chaos. And I think the only other thing I would say about this kind of the chaotic way in which things were initiated is I think it's important to keep in mind the sort of asserted justification for the executive order, which was that, right, this was supposed to, as I understand it, right, it's supposed to be we need 90 or 120 days to figure out what's going on. We got to study what's going on and find a solution for the problem. But it seems to me that in this 90 to 120 days, the government is not spending its time studying what's going on. It's reacting to litigation based on the chaos in which it rolled out the order. It's giving mixed messages about what's going on. It's saying in court that it hasn't even had time, when the judges yesterday asked government's lawyer what the national security risk was, they said, we haven't had time to figure that out, whether there's a national security risk or not, because everything's been happening so fast, which indicates that they either haven't been thinking about the problem now, or they weren't thinking about any national security justification before they issued the order, or else they would have already had that information. All of which suggests to me that the chaos was not, undermines sort of the idea that there really is an intent to kind of study the purported problem and come up with a solution in that time, and much more that this is designed to be a restrictive anti-immigration policy.
Thanks very much for that. And I think, in all of that confusion, I want to give a shout out to our Office of ISSS, Scholar Student Services, International Student Scholar Services, Jessica Cordisco, who has done such a great job together with Dr. Subir Sahu, who is our Vice President for Student Life, and really making sure that our students know what resources there are for them, responding immediately to the concerns, and providing really support for the students on campus. So as you note, we have little cards there which have the contact information on all of the seats for ISSS, and they will be continuing to be there for students, graduate students, and faculty on our campus. So just a chance to say that Drexel really did respond well in what felt like and feels like a chaotic situation. So let's look a little bit at how this is affecting immigrant populations in the United States. And we'll go to Rachel Reynolds, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Global Studies here at Drexel and on the graduate faculty. She's an expert on the political economy of migration, sociolinguistics, and ethnology of community, and has done a lot of work on children in migration, other kinds of issues around migrants, particularly young African migrants in the United States. So Rachel, maybe you can speak a little bit about the kind of anxieties or the emotional impact that this is happening on some of our immigrant populations.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this for us, Julie Mostov. I'm glad to be here. One of the things that I look at across generations of immigrants is brain drain. And brain drain is directly connected to things like international students. And one group of brain drain immigrants that have been very important to the United States, both in terms of developing our culture and carrying forward our technology and the good things about our civil society, would be Iranians. The largest international student population that's been affected by this decree are indeed Iranians. To give you one example, there's a lack of historical respect, so to speak, in the way that this was carried out, and sort of I worry about how people in these transnational communities are being affected, and their safety within countries as well. Another thing I want to say is the children of immigrants tend to outpace and contribute at a greater rate, so to speak, than native-born in the United States. They're really a lifeblood for a large number of our sectors in education, medicine, technology. And then among working-class immigrants, there are also tremendous advantages to having them among us. I want to say that this year's incoming kindergarten class is, for the first time, majority non-white, and in 18 years, this decree may be caught up a little bit, and 13 years when these kids start to vote. Anthropology is not a predictive social science, but I did speak to a few different people about the impact immediately of the decree. I talked to a representative of refugees from Pakistan earlier today, and she pointed out that even though there are large numbers of native-born in this group, the entire community feels affected. She said that the misinformation that came following on the decree led to a kind of hysteria, and this is sort of similar to what happened after 9/11. There was similar kinds of hysteria in immigrant communities. She said that lawyers in Washington, D.C. that were part of the Pakistani American community were overwhelmed trying to deal with very strange queries and trying to tamp down rumors that were in circulation. She told me, one lawyer friend told her that a couple that was traveling to California called the lawyer's office, for example, and asked if it was okay to travel to California to visit relatives. You know, that level of fear and anxiety. She also mentioned that certain things tend to sort of, what's the right word, psychologically help for these communities. One thing would be these published fact sheets, and that they're widely circulated on social media among immigrants, and there's a great deal going on clarifying and trying to document and understand what's happening. She also pointed out that the protests have been exceptionally promising, and they're talked about widely in her tightly knit refugee community, and she thinks people find them very uplifting. Let's see. As far as I want to skip over the topic here for just a second and make my comment about the Department of State, and this is a security issue. The decrees by the Trump administration often made assumptions that security mechanisms were not in place and claimed to justify themselves. They claimed to justify these decrees by saying there weren't security procedures and that they needed to be understood or vetted. But in fact, of course, there has been, especially since 9/11, an incredible amount of work among a large number of agencies, international security agencies, certainly the CIA and the FBI, the Department of State, the UN High Council, and there's also been sophisticated new technologies for tracking and understanding and verifying who's doing what and where and when and how. And the decrees seem to imply that none of that is in place, and that's why these bans were necessary. It's kind of odd. The Department of State, these are the people on the front lines in countries who have to make recommendations specific to various regions and various peoples. They have to do vetting of immigrants through the consul offices and the embassies. They have to deal with public relations and local cultural issues, and they're under a great deal of duress and psychological strain right now because of this. There are economic sections in every embassy across the United States, across the world, and in these embassies, the economic sections have to deal with the kinds of fallout that are starting to come up with the regards that governments and business people have for United States travel and the general environment in the United States for Muslim immigrants. And they have to deal with diplomacy, right? And so they're under threat by these decrees. These career diplomats are not always Democrats, they're not always Republicans. They're career people who are patriots and have a genuine desire to serve the United States. They're highly trained, they're very, very careful. Consulate officers are often lawyers with immigration backgrounds and understand the law and understand security and immigration and vetting. They work, of course, with local agencies. If you're in Somalia or Sudan, knowledge on the ground, well, there's not an embassy in Somalia right now, but if you're working with people who are working in those countries, you have to have knowledge of what's going on, and you have to have cooperation in order to truly well vet various kinds of refugees and immigrants. You have to have knowledge of databases and security apparatus across the world, and these people do have this, and this decree's been very disrespectful to them and jeopardizing of them. So I wanted to mention that.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna, I think probably that's why we have amicus briefs from diplomats and security officers, national security officers, from the 100 CEOs of companies, tech companies in Silicon Valley, and why we have all these states, including Pennsylvania, that have joined in the briefs, because there are economic, social, political, and other ramifications that go beyond what we consider sort of the immediate impacts. I do want to ask Assistant Professor Alden Young, who is also the Director of Africana Studies and a historian at Drexel, whose expertise is on Sudan. And in fact, his latest book, Accounting for Decolonization of the Origins of Sudanese Economy, has done a lot of work in the region, and is going to tell us a little bit, I hope, tell us a little bit about how this is affecting the Sudanese community.
Thank you again for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be on this panel and with so many incredibly smart people. Well, first, I would like to say that one of the things you have to think about in context of the 7 countries that were chosen, they're all 7 countries in which the United States has a very complicated relationship. If one were looking for a pattern, one might suggest that these were not countries of immediate, that the justification presented is not the most obvious justification for why you would choose these 7 countries. These are all 7 countries in which there are actually hostile, there are hostilities in which the United States is a participant in. And so in Yemen, there's been a war since 2015. In Iran, there's been sanctions at least since 1979, which have been intensified several different times. And there's disputes about, what the relationship should be with Iran. In Sudan, there's been sanctions on the country since 1997. In Iraq, of course, since 2003. Somalia, there's been an active relationship since 1993, and again, intervention in 2006. In Libya, the United States has been participating since 2011. And at first glance, one would assume that this is actually a rather hostile action that was taken. And it was an interesting action in case of Sudan, which is the country I know the most about, because it's a dramatic reversal from what President Obama was doing right before. So in the case of Sudan, a week before the executive order comes out, there was actually a move to begin removing sanctions across Sudan. Sudan is a country in which you cannot use your Visa card, in case anybody wants to download iTunes. It's not possible. Travel is incredibly restricted. You cannot apply for a visa from Khartoum. There are at least 3 sanctions regimes sponsored by the United States across the country. It's very hard to do educational exchanges. But Sudan is also one of our largest cooperators in counterterrorism in Islamic Africa. And it was for this reason, and because Sudan has become incredibly cooperative with regional partners such as Saudi Arabia in the war that they're engaging in Yemen, that there was a lobbying by our allies and by parts of the United States security establishment to begin a process of removing sanctions from Sudan. And so it was a sharp reversal to then engage in this executive order. One of Sudan's main sources of economic stability is actually remittances from foreign workers. And one of the most interesting things is that one of the largest populations of foreigners from Sudan, or immigrants from Sudan in the United States, are people who have migrated as refugees, either from Darfur or from the regional conflicts in Sudan, or there's tons of pro-democracy advocates who have often responded to what they saw as calls from the United States and risked their lives, engaged in protests and demonstrations, only to be thrown into this turmoil about whether or not they would be able to travel, what their status would be, could their green cards be revoked. And so I think it's very important to think in context, when thinking about this order, about America's own position in the greater Middle East and in the Horn of Africa in general. Thank you.
So thinking a little bit in a different direction, I wanted to ask Dean Anna Diaz-Ruz, who, as I said, is the Dean of this Dornsife School of Public Health and also Distinguished University Professor of Epidemiology. What are we seeing as the health implications of this kind of a ban?
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everybody. Core public health values include valuing every life, equity, and preventing harm. And so there are a number of ways in which this executive order could affect these public health values and the health of the public generally. And I'm going to be brief and mention 4 ways. The first way, perhaps the most obvious way, is through its potential effects on the health and the future of refugees who are, for reasons that are often affect their health very directly and affect their lives very directly, are attempting to leave very dangerous places. And I don't think that should be underestimated in terms of the very direct health implications of not allowing those people to flee their dangerous situation. And we have many examples throughout history where countries have refused to take in refugees with very, terrible implications. A second potential way in which this order could affect the health of the public has to do with the impact of immigrants, documented and undocumented, living in the United States. And one relatively direct mechanism that has been shown in situations like this has to do with the fact that immigrants change their behaviors in response to what they perceive as an environment which is not inclusive of them. And so, for example, they may very directly change their healthcare seeking behaviors. And certainly undocumented immigrants, but potentially documented immigrants as well. And this reluctance perhaps to seek healthcare when they should obviously may affect their own health, but can have implications for the health of the community at large, because as you know, many of the things that affect health are contagious. And so if we have immigrants who are not seeking health care when they should, that has implications not only for their health, but for the health of their families and the health of the communities in which they live. It may also have implications for their willingness to seek other kinds of services. Examples include victims of domestic violence, for example, who may feel that they are, that may be reluctant to seek, be in contact with any sort of government agency that could potentially identify them as an immigrant or threaten or deport them or put them on a list, or there are all these questions about what's going to happen to me if this is happening to some of these other people who are immigrants or trying to immigrate to this country. There are other much more subtle effects, but equally important effects that have to do with the stress-related consequences of threat and discrimination. And there are studies, for example, showing measurable impacts of immigration raids, for example, on the birth outcomes of Latino mothers. There's a very recent paper that came out just a couple of months ago. I'm very familiar with it because it was the lead author was one of my former doctoral students, and I'm not a co-author on the paper. She showed that, using an example of immigrant raids in Iowa, that the rates of low birth weight increased, for example, in Latina mothers, even those who were legal immigrants after the raid, and there was no similar increase in other individuals, other mothers, pregnant women living in the same area. There's also another study, for example, showing increases in adverse birth outcomes post 9/11 among Arab American pregnant women in the Detroit area, in response to a series of activities that happened after that event that Arab immigrants could perceive as threatening or stressful. There are probably other many subtle ways in which the threat of and the stigma and the, and the sense of being discriminated against can affect health in subtle ways. And the fourth way, I think, has to do, which affects us, I think, very directly, has to do with the effect on science and education and public health practice, because we in the public health community, as in many other communities, benefit enormously from the input of immigrants from all nations. And so, unfortunately, we're already starting to see, I've heard anecdotally from colleagues who are organizing meetings, people saying, well, do I really want to come to this meeting in the US now? And questions about, well, is that going to happen? Are we going to be able to travel? Do we really want to go there? We'd rather, not just because they can't get visas or perceive that they might be more difficult to get visas, but just because they feel that it's an environment that is not welcoming to people of other nations. And so I think those are four ways in which the order could affect the public health broadly.
Thank you so much. And now that leads me to introduce Dr. Banu Anaral, who is the H.H. Sun Professor of Biomedical Engineering and the Senior Advisor to President on Global Partnerships. Banu, if you can give some indication about how does this affect our global partnerships, our scientific collaboration. This is, of course, one of the major reasons that so many university presidents and our president and provost and so many faculty members signed on to concerns about the travel ban, and because, of course, it affects the major values of a university, which is the exchange of ideas and certainly scientific information. So if you can speak a little bit to that, that would be great.
Certainly. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Yes, let me just take this. Yes, I have been working on my own and then now more formally on Global Innovation Partnership, because not only me, but all my colleagues, the senior administration, not only at this university, universities all over believe in the fact that science, technology, education, innovation transcend all cultural, all national, all political boundaries, that we, as especially academicians, who are the guardians of the accumulated knowledge of humanity, we are mandated, we are actually sharing the core values all over the world. So we cannot distinguish, we cannot separate, we cannot truly have the test of nationality, faith, or religion, or ethnic background. When we are sharing information and we are applying the scientific methodology, and we are certainly, in my case, working on jointly on an innovation. I like to say a few things because on this panel, I think in addition to Bahram, I'm the only Muslim. Would you be, are you Muslim? Yeah, okay, so there are 3 Muslims. But, oh, you're not a Muslim, okay. So, but in any case, so because the underlying theme has been this Muslim ban during the campaign, and now through this very confusing executive order, I have to reflect, maybe you could help me too, from that perspective. All of a sudden, in a country where for 40 plus years, I contributed, put heart and soul into not only working on science, technology, education, the next generation, and so on and so forth, I feel like all of a sudden I am in a different category. This had never happened before. This is the place where the whole world looked up to, because we not only cherish the academic freedom, but also we cherish the standards of scholarships that are of the highest caliber. So that's why the whole brain trust of the world, and I think Rachel mentioned brain drain, finally, after all these years of shuttling between my home country, but more so China, and partially in Israel, in Israel less. In China, the perception was it's a brain drain. Finally, after all these years of science diplomacy, working with all the sectors in these two countries, finally we had started in all my lectures, on all my workshops, I talk of brain gain, because it's mutual gain. There is a win-win in this when we are collaborating. So let me just basically state a wish that I have as a truly sort of veteran of the academia. We must, and I'm looking up to Provost Blake, we must be part of a solidarity statement across our academic sector. And this is not only the universities, it's also research organizations. We all need each other in this. We cannot identify, separate, put a group together. Right now, in Turkey, and it has been in the news in the last 10 days, there is this thing that we're in the next list of people. Of course, being a citizen of United States and citizen of Turkey, I truly do not worry too much specifically about such categories, but those with green cards, those who constantly travel, who have labs on both sides, who help, who work on projects. Let me also put you in a, so there is this high level of anxiety, confusion, and whether we should not question our admiration about the finest of academic accomplishment, achievement that United States was able to bring about by opening, embracing the whole world, starting actually very far back since the Republic, but also later on in recent years. Think of the 30s when the Nazi regime took hold. Then a very large number of scholars and academics came here, and they breathed life into so-called, I must say, second-rate academic institutions. This has not only happened here in US, it happened all over the world, including my home country, Turkey, where in the 30s they came and reinvented our universities. So there is always this reality. If you go and just walk in the hallway in the science and technology, engineering kind of departments, colleges, schools, in any university in this country, the complexion is not just born here. It is a very diverse complexion, and because of that diversity, we have created humongous value, not only for US, but for the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Banu. And I'm going to then turn to Bahram, who is a professor of electrical engineering in our College of Engineering, whose research is on a very different subject, but as a person from the region, from Iran, has a very, and has a number of graduate students, as Banu was mentioning, and colleagues from so many parts of the world that are affected by these kinds of bans on travel and scholarship, that he wants to say a little bit about the way in which this kind of executive order can affect the work of graduate students, faculty, and other scholars.
Yes, thank you, Julie. You know, it's sort of hard to participate in this conversation because we're very logical people, and this is a university. So we think that we set the premise, we say the rules that are very scientific, and then we end up, you know, one side of the equation says 2, the other side says 3, and we say, well, 2 is less than 3, and then we drop the mic, we say this is QED, we have proven what we have. And that premise right now in this environment doesn't hold. We have a case in which that 2 is a number of people attending an event, and 3 is the number of people attending same place, another event. And then we end up in an alternative universe that 3 is more than 2. All of the conversation that was done here has a scientific, factual basis, which somehow in this inverse universe, alternative facts, that we find ourselves hard to justify that something that is very obvious. And so one can also give anecdotal evidence, but how can you give anecdotal evidences if your president is a joke? It's difficult to participate. At the same time, though, what we are observing and what we are discussing here is very real and has very strong ramifications. A number of excellent points have been made that I can pick up from, I think, Banu, what you said about 1930s is very relevant to the universities, to us. The scientific refugees that arrived in the United States changed the center of gravity of science. The work that was done, in fact, I was just reading this piece that in 1939, an Italian immigrant arrived for his appointment with a Navy admiral in Washington. He overheard the desk officer announcing there's a WAP outside. WAP, it was a term for an Italian thug. The immigrant had just arrived in the United States and 2 months earlier had stopped in Stockholm to pick up his Nobel Prize in Physics, Enrico Fermi. And he ended up not only running the Manhattan Project, but it's not just making the atomic bomb, but it is changing the view of the humanity of matter. That is physics, science as we know it. And by the way, during all of that time, he was an enemy alien. He was not allowed to travel between Columbia and University of and Chicago because couldn't have a shortwave radio, could not have binoculars, and could not travel being an enemy alien. Yet that group and that 1930s to 1940s, what they did in bringing Hungarians, Austrians, and others, and Germans, of course, to the United States, changed the landscape of what we have. Regarding this, the second period that's something about security and science, I think, historically becomes important, is around 2000, after September 11th, 2001, that people then ask, probably rightly so, who are these immigrants, and especially, from these countries that are mentioned here. So there was a National Science Board. National Science Board had a report in 2001. This is just short paragraph of the report that they said that relates to our discussion, that the scale and nature of ongoing revolution in science and technology and what this implies for the quality of human capital in the 21st century pose critical national security challenges for the United States. Second only to a weapon of mass destruction detonating in an American city, we can think of nothing more dangerous than a failure to manage properly science, technology, and education for the common good over the next quarter century. And that is very true. Now, the executive order that has just been issued, who keeps the scientific refugees away? Who does it keep away? People like Kamran Wafa, who's a professor at a Dirac medalist, member of National Academy of Science, just won the Breakthrough Prize. Professor at Harvard, I think Iranian. Mariam Mirzakhani is the first woman field medalist. Professor at Stanford. And a lot, a large number of others that I can say, I can refer to. There are presently 17,000 students affected by this ban of these 7 countries, 12,000 of whom are Iranian. In the past 3 years, 3,000 doctorates have been awarded to Iranians in United States institutions in the past 3 years. These are the people that are going to be banned. It just really, what can you say? It seems like the world has a stiff neck epidemic that you hear all of this and just shake your head and then go on.
So as we're shaking our heads, let's also think about the fact that you see as a university that there are opportunities to have a discussion, to learn from one another, and to think about, what can we do with our collective knowledge to make our world a better place and a safer place as we discuss and come together and question and then use the evidence of our particular disciplines to help us think about collective solutions. And so now, of course, the important part is we have all these experts here, and you've probably been waiting patiently with some questions. So I'd like to, before I start the questions, I just want to give a big shout out to Sandra Petri, who helped put together the whole thing, including our technology. And again to ISSS and our student life, all of the people who are working there so tirelessly, our graduates college as well, and everyone who's really been reaching out to students across the university. Sandra is going to be walking around with the mic, so if we have questions, we've got about, don't have too much, we have almost a half an hour, so that we're doing really well. Kara, you want to?
I just have a really simple question, which is, what should we do? And what can we do?
You were first, you want to throw something out?
I've got one, it's a little touchy-feely, but all of the Muslim friends that I've called and talked to or met, or my ophthalmologist is a Muslim from Pakistan, again, different person. I just said, I didn't vote for this guy, I'm glad they're here. If someone says something horrible to you, tell me, I'll confront them for you. And they've all, I think that genuinely helps. That's a tiny thing, but that human reassurance is really
So words of solidarity. Anil, do you want to give some other comments in terms of the law?
So I would just add, first, what a wonderful set of things. I would add that I think it's really at a crisis moment, just a lot of the comments that folks have made. We're at a crisis moment for institutions. And, whether it's media, whether it's local governments, state governments, whether it's the judiciary. And I think that there are ways in which all of us should be able to think about engaging locally and really, becoming more civically engaged, but not simply thinking about national politics, thinking about local institutions. The framework within these executive orders, there's the policy questions, but there's also a political dynamic. So, for example, the Interior Enforcement Order has within it a propaganda machine of the kinds of alternative facts that Bahram is mentioning, whereby every week there's going to be a list of crimes supposedly committed by people who have been released in so-called sanctuary jurisdiction. And I think that all of us need to be ready to support and, as appropriate, challenge local elected officials to sort of stand up and sort of really engage, in the way that some of our, university leaders have in the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm proudly a citizen of Iran, and I'm not a Muslim, so I don't have any problem with the travel ban. But as a human, I'm really insulted by something that I'm not. And I should say that even the President of the United States cannot tell me something that I'm not the terrorist. And if I'm not welcome here, I can leave this country. I can go, I'm a scientist. I can go to another country that human dignity respect more, has more values. I can go to Canada. I live in Germany. I never had such a feeling. I can go there somewhere that, be treated as a scientist.
And I think, I think that's a strong feeling that many people here believe that the dignity of persons is such a key value in the United States that I think this is another reason why people were shocked, that something that as, like a law of our land would go so against the values that are enshrined in the Constitution and in the institutions of the country. So I think that that's why we're feeling such a strong reaction, and the feelings of solidarity or the questions about how can we reach out to our colleagues and support the community of science and a community of humans.
Yeah, this is very, of course, distressing, I think, to all of us, particularly to me as a descendant of refugees. But I had a sort of a concrete question, which was, I'm right now making an offer of admission to a PhD student from Iran. Do you think there's any hope at all that I'll be able to get this student to Drexel anytime in the foreseeable future?
Richard, do you want to speak to that?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I know. No, the stays in place. Do it now.
Yeah. Come now while the stay is in place, right? Anil, did you want to comment on that from a...
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the stay is in place, and so, whatever, of course, for these countries, it's been challenging to receive admissions already for a while, but for the moment, as we understand it, this should be proceeding as an interview. So, do it quickly.
Yeah.
To answer the question, so it is a legal point at this time that whether students are getting visa appointments or not is not clear. Visa appointments or not is not clear. But to also answer Kara's question as what we as a university should provide the refuge that these scientists need. So keep your PhD students and the university and do support them, and the university has the obligation to support particularly the students, the international students that come from these countries. And also, let me tell you that the vetting process for this refugee, taking refuge in the academy, is incredible. The vetting process, 600 and some thousand people take exam to enter university, and the best of those then end up here. I have a student here in the audience who, of the 600,000, so ranked number 27. How else can you vet these people? So, I'm bringing
Yeah, I think there's a question back there.
Yes, we have spoken about the threat that that this ruling is going to, or threatens us to stop or slow down in the influx of scientific genius from all over the world, but especially those countries. Now, we've also had spoken about this, the 1930s in Europe, and that scientists fled that environment. Do you think with the political situation here, we're not only threatened by the slowing of the influx of scientists, but also flight to more politically and maybe even financially welcoming environments?
Yeah, I think probably everybody is worried about that.
I should probably First of all, yes, there is talk, because I'm on the ground in China working on a lot of the projects. They are making great offers. And by this time, because we have joint dual PhD programs, we see how wonderful the labs are. And Kara just returned, so you probably have some comments. The genius of the world will choose other places, for sure. The damage has been done. So I'm looking at James, and he's shaking his head. You probably felt it, because the students with whom we're in contact, in my case in China, but also in Turkey, are having second thoughts. They are questioning, as I said when I shared my comments, their admiration. They truly upheld this amazing trust in the system, democracy, and the sort of the constant support to science and technology, and to the talent and the capacity, the promise, the potential. That's why they all converged.
Right.
Imagine what happens when that stops.
And I think, we've seen a lot of data so far about the potential losses in dollars, both in industry and trade and investment, but also in students on campuses, their families, tourism, all the kind of things. Conferences where people, as Anna Diaz-Ruiz said, many people are deciding not to come here for international conferences, and they may in the future be held somewhere else. As those students may decide to go to Canada, Yeah.
So I'm a postdoc fellow here at Drexel. I'm also Iranian. To confirm, I'm also thinking about leaving this country, and I don't know if you guys remember or not. I was a PhD student at UMass when there was a ban on the Iranian students on the engineering fields at University of Massachusetts. And 2 years ago, again, we had to deal with something like this. So I would say these kind of restrictions on Iranians, or as the gentleman mentioned, these countries that the United States has got historic hostile relationships with the administrations of it's nothing new. We've been dealing with it since the liberals were in the office. We're dealing with it now. The fascists are in the office. And I kind of want to criticize ourselves, because sometimes we have a lot of trust in the administrations of the liberals, and we don't react in the way that we should. That when the fascists kind of come and take over the power and do those things in a more brutal or a more offensive fashion, we just are reminded, oh, maybe something is wrong. As an Iranian, I've had a single entry visa for 7 years, and I was given that visa by Obama administration. I haven't been able to see my family for 7 years, and I'm really getting sick of it. How many years, how many more years I should be able not to see my family? I'm just leaving, and wherever I can go, I would just go. And I think we should get, all of us, we should get more involved in politics. We should, sometimes we talk in a way that talking is not just enough. We're dealing, what can I do now? 2 years ago when this happened, I was on CNN every day. I was on Al Jazeera. I was talking out. I wanted to change it. I went all out to change it. But now I'm just so tired of having to do it all the time. This time, I was contacted again by so many journalists that I was speaking to 2 years ago, and I was like, I don't care. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm done. And honestly, what can I do? I can get the support of Chuck Schumer. The guy is laughing at Chuck Schumer. Who is going to listen to me? I get the support of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer. The guy doesn't listen to John McCain. There's nothing. We got to speak the same language. We got to resist. They're destroying lives. They're destroying your country. They're destroying my country. They're destroying the planet. We should get serious. We should get involved, and we should be able to speak the same language that they are speaking.
So I think what you've mentioned, one of the things is get involved. And there are so many different ways to get involved as students, I think locally, joining some of the different movements, learning, keeping up, really understanding what the facts are, and being able to participate in political activities. I think this is, Aaron, did you want to say anything from a political science point of view? What are our best avenues for getting engaged, being effective?
Well, beyond, I sympathize with your exhaustion, and so I know it's, you know far better than me, in fact, and I'm sure are more tired and have endured a great deal more frustration. Nevertheless, I don't know what else we can do besides to kind of echo some of Anil's comments. That is, we have to engage. And if we plan to stay here, native born or not, we have to continue to engage even though we're going to be exhausted, right? I mean, in the wake of this election, it's been encouraging to get out. I know Alden and I have talked about this and participate in some of the protests and marches, but we can't let that stop in a couple of months and sort of go back to our lives. It's encouraging to see there's been some events in the city of Philadelphia about how to run for office, getting new people engaged, continuing to make calls to your House members and senators, even though I know a lot of times it doesn't seem like they're listening. So I don't know what the most efficacious way to proceed is, but I think there are many people now, and I think you're right that many of us should have been concerned much sooner. I think there are a lot of people, I would count myself among them, that kind of thought the middle would hold to some extent in American politics, and it didn't. And so it seems to me there are a lot of people speaking out and getting engaged now that have been sitting on the sidelines, and that's maybe one somewhat encouraging thing. And I would just encourage everybody to keep doing that.
Let me add one comment really
Oh,
quick.
I wanted to give a question. Did you want to?
Just one very quick comment.
Sorry.
And also about getting involved, know exactly who your representatives are at all levels in the city, in your home, in your town that you live in the state legislature. Figure out who they are, who's up and coming, support people who are up and coming. Know who the judges are, because they are the people who will eventually be appointed down the line to higher judgeships if they start succeeding and doing well. Pay attention to all that. It's a slog, it's hard to find out about, but we have a lot of great social media tools to get into that and start to learn about it.
And we have great local officials. I mean, we're lucky with Helen Gim, we have, Mayor Kenny, we are Sanctuary City, so it is a good place to get involved. And of course, at the university, there are also student groups, and you have some great faculty resources here. Question.
My question is a little more concrete. The justification for this was obviously the 7 countries were identified in a report under the Obama administration. What is the panel's evaluation of that justification, and how do they think that it'll play out in court, this justification?
Anil, you've already spoken to this. Do you want to say something?
Sure. So the list that very quickly the Trump administration is looked to this list from it's not it's apples and oranges really, because what the Obama administration was doing was not a shutdown of people coming to the country. It was something different. So for that to be the justification, coupled with all the practical a lot makes a sort of calls that into question.
Did you understand?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Alden, did you want to?
Oh, I just wanted to jump in at an earlier point, maybe. I think we have to be very careful about. My first roommate in college was Jordanian, and he was very successful at Columbia University. He got a successful job at J.P. Morgan, and his father was the Minister of Finance in Jordan. So I mean, he was from a very prominent family. And I remember the first time he told me he wasn't coming back for his second year at J.P. Morgan, and I asked him why. And he had been to the visa interview, and they asked him if he had bomb-making skills. And he was a Christian. And thinking about it logically, his family was one of the US's greatest allies in that country. But there is a soft bigotry that I think that's what makes me hopeful, is that in some ways it's come out in the open, right? And you see it in the marches. I went to the Women's March, and you can see in the Women's March, banners like Black Lives Matter, and now there's finally no wall, no ban. And there's a soft bigotry in this country that we've been sleeping on. I mean, Obama, I loved Obama. I felt so proud when he was elected. But he was afraid to have women in hijabs behind him in 2008. And you can see the progress in the fact that way in which Islamophobia has come to the fore in our political process. But I think that's something that is not just about this particular ban and the ineptitude in which Trump made it explicit. It's something that we all have to fight, and the Islamophobia that we've long tolerated in this country, and the racialization of Muslims as well, as a racial category. So what makes it so that a border guard thinks that he knows the religion of an Iranian? First, he doesn't know that Iran has different religions, and then second, he thinks that Muslims look a certain way, which is why Sikhs often get attacked. Unfortunately, they look more Muslim in our imagination than often an Albanian, right? I mean, these are prejudices that we need to continue to tackle and confront openly.
So, Alden, since you mentioned that, and thank you very much, I'm going to mention the event that you have tomorrow night, Hip Hop, Islam, Gender, Activism, Race, an evening with Suad Abdul Kabir, who is a PhD author of Muslim Cool, and, okay, I'm not sure of that one.
Yeah, so she's an author of Muslim Cool, and it's an amazing book on US Muslim identity and the ways in which hip hop and blackness have been used to create a unique kind of Islam here in the United States, an open identity, and talking about some of the youth movements that are creating a positive vision of what Islam can be.
And that's in this room at 6 to 7:30 tomorrow night. So that's a chance for me to say that. It is 6:30, and I want to thank everybody here. Provost Blake, do you want to give some closing? I want to thank everybody again for coming here, for supporting this, and just the beginning of conversations. Provost Blake is really the really inspiration for this, because he reminded us all at an event that was organized earlier, which was that we are at a university and we have scholars, and we need to look to our scholarly research and background resources to answer some of the questions that are challenging and before us today.
First, I just want to thank our panelists. I learned a whole lot, so thank you so much for your candidness and actually sharing your insights. I think we had Julie put together a really nice panel with regards to kind of the diversity of thought. I just want to encourage you. I think from a university perspective, we've been from the beginning very supportive of our international students. I think both of our statements have generally said that. We've met a couple times since this statement with outside legal and counsel to kind of understand, where we could actually even more support students moving forward. So that's we're continually having those conversations, but I do want to assure, our students that are in the crowd that that's on the forefront of your leadership. So thanks a lot for coming. I think these events are so good for us to share and to gather and to have these conversations, to get different insights, which I appreciate, and look forward to seeing you in our events as we move forward. So thanks again for the panelists, and